Hi there, I'm Joshua Higgins, and I'm a preacher here, evangelist at the Pratt Parkway Christians in Longmont, Colorado. Hopefully you've been on this channel, you've seen some of the sermons that we've posted, and that's been an encouragement to you. You've enjoyed looking at God's Word, trying to understand God and know how we can live in a way that pleases God. What I want to do going forward, and we're going to try to do this now, is a series of podcasts called Encouraging Conversations. We want to encourage people to talk things through, and in particular, to have conversations where God's brought to the middle of it. In the book of Isaiah, God begins with this kind of undressing of Israel and the fact that they went through all the motions of worship, but their hearts were not right with Him. In fact, they weren't treating each other very well. And at verse 18, He makes this great statement where He says, "Come now, let us reason together." You see, I think people, what makes us unreasonable is when we stop trying to reason things through with God as our source of authority. And so this Encouraging Conversations podcast is about encouraging us to do just that. Have those conversations about what's going on in our world and how God sees it, about what's going on in Scripture and how it applies to us. I want to bring God to the conversation, and so we'll do a series of studies through the Bible with various friends from all over the nation. I'm excited about this opportunity. But to start, we're going to go with a topic that's current. We're going to talk about race, and I have a good friend, Tony Angelo, now living in Bremerton, Washington. Tony is a clinical psychologist, and we're going to talk about race through a couple of episodes here and hope that you'll be encouraged by it. But keep tuning in as we continue encouraging conversations. I hope it'll be a pep talk for you. I hope it's something that'll encourage you to look further into what God says and what God wants so that we might be true lights in this world. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're encouraged. Well, we're glad that you can join us, and I'm super happy to have you here. The fact that we talked about doing this, and you said I'll fly in Sunday was absolutely amazing and not at all surprising. Having you been such a good friend all these years. I want to just give you a chance to meet my friend Tony Angelo, who now, it's kind of hard for me to say this, actually is visiting from Washington. Bremerton, Washington. It's been California for so many years. But Tony was one of those great friends that you look up to. I remember going to summer camps. We've talked a lot about just what that meant to us growing up, but took a real interest in me and many others and had great concern for where we were spiritually. Over the years, your work in Jamaica gave me the chance to go and really see the good work going on there. Loved all those times together. We have a lot of stories, maybe for another episode. We can talk about some Jamaica stories. Right. But I want to just say thank you for joining us. We're going to talk today. I kind of mentioned to the congregation here, we're just going to start having some harder conversations, some uncomfortable conversations so that we can grow and learn. And today we want to start talking about race and justice. And so I'll let you, Tony, kind of just say hi and introduce why we would be talking about this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So, I think what's interesting is, I kind of couched it as why would two white guys, right, get together and certainly, not pretend to be experts on race,
right?
But why would we be having this conversation? And I think there's a couple of really good reasons for that. Is one, you don't have to convince African Americans or people of color that there is an issue with race in America.
Right.
I think that generally the folks we have to convince of that tend to be white people. And so I think that it's important for us to have these conversations and share perhaps what we've learned, what we have seen along the way that may be useful, because I think that the majority of the time people are well-meaning who just simply may not have in their lived experience some of these issues that come up with not being white in America. And I think it's super important that we have those uncomfortable conversations.
Well, and in a sense, you're uniquely qualified, and we're not seeing this, and race is generally about what you see. And so maybe kind of introduce us to what would make you uniquely qualified to talk about some of these things and how they've affected your life and impacted you in specific ways to people you love and know.
Yeah. So I think it's important to say that I've never been black a day in my life.
This is shocking. Yeah.
In fact, I have been whiter than most. But I digress. But I have certainly not been black a day in my life, and I don't pretend to have been black and experience that and what that is. But as you mentioned, Jamaica. When I was 14 years old, took my first trip with my dad to Jamaica, and have literally been going to Jamaica ever since. And met my wife in Jamaica in I met her in 1993. We were married in 1995.
In my parents' house.
Yeah, actually that's true. Although I guess since you brought that up, I have to mention, we were actually married in Vegas and then did a ceremony.
Full disclosure.
At your parents' house. Yeah, I don't want us being accused of any prevarication.
That was a lie.
It was a lie.
Absolutely.
So, it's very interesting that my life changed drastically in terms of my marriage to a black female from a different culture as well, I will say, to the process of having children. And honestly, not even knowing what that was going to mean as my kids were growing up. And then watching that process happen and being faced with the fact that, and I have said this to many people many times before, that my son and I have a very different experience. My son's now 23.
Yeah, I was going to say age of kids.
So my daughter now is 22. My wife is, oh, just kidding. And
good call.
So he and I, we have a different experience. I'll never fully walk in the footsteps of my son and fully understand his experience, but I have been faced with the fact there is a difference and a distinction, including interactions that he has had with the police. Some of those have been very frightening and frequent. And my daughter as well. Certainly, she has a different experience as well. But this kind of forced me to realize that there is something going on here. And also, I have benefited greatly from my wife's experiences as well, as we talk about these things and share back and forth.
Well, I'm glad you came out, and this is the stuff we want to talk about. And maybe to get us started with that background in mind, I wanted to look at, because we talked on the phone a little bit about the conversation we want to have and what this would look like. And Matthew 25 certainly comes to mind. You've got this judgment text. And as Jesus looks out at the world, those he's called he's called everyone. But there's a division, and he divides between the faithful and the unfaithful, the goats and the sheep. He's making a separation. And in that separation, it seems like those who are going to be excluded from his kingdom are surprised and want to know why. And as you continue to read, those who are accepted into the kingdom are also surprised and want to know why. What have we done? And in that dialogue, Jesus lets them know kind of a maybe something we wouldn't expect. It's that in the way you treated even the least of these among you, I know that you loved me. And so this conversation about race, and we'll talk a little bit about justice in this hour, that kind of brings us to think about distinctions between people because of race that exist. And I know we're going to have several people that are listening that maybe lived through some of the 60s and the changes that went on in our culture that were really pro-race relations. And yet, as we've come to this point, we mentioned today, perhaps we've fallen asleep at the wheel a bit and stopped having conversations, and tough conversations, so that we can look at where we really are, assess plainly where we're at, what are the causes to this, what are some of the things that I know we're going to have people watching that want to do something about it, what are some effective things they can do, and then ultimately how God kind of looks at this, because he does care ultimately about how image bearers treat other image bearers. And so that'll kind of set the tone for what we want to do. Yeah,
definitely. And I think maybe there's a piece to just interject here to that too, is you're absolutely right, is you have to look out for the least of these, those who might be subject to treatment that is not just, racism, these kinds of things. And the fact that we have to be willing to accept that there might be something going on here more than what I recognize. I think that would be a big part, I think, of what maybe we would hope to accomplish in some of this today
Yeah.
is that if you are a person who is sitting out there, you're a white person sitting out there who thinks, but we've come so far,
Right.
I don't understand. Like, why are these things, why is this an issue now?
Right.
I think is to open yourself up to realize that, yes, of course, there's been progress that has been made.
Right.
But be willing to listen to the fact that there might be things that you're not aware of, that you don't understand, that are going on.
So maybe speaks to what it is to not be the least of these.
Right.
And the sense that in hearing that, what do you mean there's a problem, brings up almost a defensiveness.
Yeah.
Because in our road, on our path, it seems to be just fine. Things are better than they were in our minds. That really is narrow-minded, and isn't seeing the broad picture. And so I really want to open this up to, to think about with you and Tristan, for your son to say, boy, life is different. Here's some of my challenges. And for you to say, I haven't experienced any of that, and ignore it, would really be poor parenting, to say the least.
Yeah.
It's poor human interaction, to say the least, and it's poor brotherly love to not try to look a little deeper and say, I may not have experienced it, but how can I know better what the experience is and what part I can play in some healing and some moving forward?
Yeah, because there's a lot of, maybe I would say a lot of hubris in dismissing an entire race of people telling you, hey, there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And we would like you to help us in this. We'd like you to be more aware of this, and to dismiss that is I think a lot of hubris there. I think it's reflected, actually. I think one of the things that I might mention at this point is to kind of say, I think it's reflected in this somewhat reflexive need when someone says, and I realize we'll wade into some deeper waters here.
Right.
When someone says Black Lives Matter, and the retort to that is, well, all lives matter, is to say, okay, well, we're all on equal footing here. Your experience really isn't that much different than my experience.
Right.
So why are you singling yourselves out? And these folks saying, because there is something more going on here.
Right.
And we're asking you to hear that. We're asking you to listen to that.
Right.
And we need to be willing to say, maybe there is something going on here that I'm not fully aware of, because it is outside of my lived experience.
Yeah, and I want to put a disclaimer on here, because everything we're going to say is going to be opened up to the internet, and people have a chance to bash the intent and the heart of this.
Certainly.
And this is coming from a very pure place. And so with that in mind, what are some stupid things white people can say? Whether it's to show ignorance, absolute meanness, or hatred, which we just understand clearly is not the way God wants us to live and love. What are some things we kind of trip on, maybe even trying to do good, that we really ought to start, as James would kind of indicate, be better listeners, and less quick to talk and speak, especially outside our experience. What are some of those traps maybe we're falling into that we could start looking at as a solution?
Well, one of the things I think that the argument that I would make to this is to realize, and maybe I'll share even the analogy that I stole from somewhere else that I heard on the internet, a young lady talking about, hey, our experience as African Americans has been, imagine playing Monopoly, and for essentially 400 years, you weren't allowed to keep anything on the board. So every time you got Park Place, but you couldn't keep it. You built Park Place, but you couldn't keep it. And you went around the board, and everything you accomplished or did was literally just taken away from you. And then during Jim Crow years, right, you're able to do these things, but if you were too successful, if things went too well, we might take that away from you as well. And this was not that long ago. So when we talk about, slavery itself, of course, that there was a period of time where, slavery was abolished, but not a lot had changed in reality. And so, I think that not recognizing the historical significance of always being told that you don't belong or you are not wanted in the country of your birth, generation after generation, has created an environment where we subtly still communicate that to people, And so I think kind of diving into some of those things, statements that get made are things like, well, if they wanted to, someone can just pack up and leave.
That's a rough neighborhood. You don't like it. Get out of there.
Get out of it. Yeah, get out of it.
So that's insensitive.
Yeah. Well, it fails to understand the fact that, and I guess, we had kind of talked about this a little earlier.
Right.
I work, and maybe I would mention at this point
this is good. Yeah.
that I work as a clinical psychologist, and I specifically work in the criminal justice system.
Right.
And so I work with folks who, in many cases, have had a history of disadvantage. They were born into broken families. They were born into situations of poverty, things like that. I often say that the common denominator of the folks who come through my clinics are public defenders. That's the common denominator.
Yeah.
Rarely do I have someone who comes through my clinic who was able to have a lawyer,
get a real lawyer,
get a real, and again, not to say there aren't public defenders who work really hard and do a good job,
but overwhelmed to say the least.
Totally overwhelmed, especially in California, Southern California, where I'm at. I mean, totally overwhelmed.
Right.
And then there are some who don't care, and it's take a deal,
right?
And these kinds of factors, and then your upbringing has had such a powerful influence on who you are. So the analogy that I often use with our guys is to say, it's easy for me to sit here and tell you, you need to live more like me. Right? I haven't been to prison, haven't been to jail. I've always been able to secure good employment. You should live life more like me.
Yep.
And that really doesn't take into account a lot of realities.
Right.
So I'm asking a guy who was born in poverty, and what he saw around him, maybe he grew up in an area with lots of drugs and crime, and the skill set that he developed was fitted to that environment.
Right.
So now I'm just asking him to, I want you now to come out of that.
Yeah.
I want you to move more into our world. I want you to go to some job interviews now. I want you to develop resumes. I want you to do these kinds of things. And the reality is, in fact, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a specific example of this. There was a young man recently who his father was in gangs, and he was pretty much on the streets, 30 years of drugs, his dad.
Yeah.
And so this young man also was raised up in that environment and pretty much raised up on the streets himself.
Yeah.
And getting into that gang lifestyle. And then there was kind of something happened. His dad, when he was about 16 years old, his dad kind of said, hey, I'm changing my life. And he did. His dad really made some big changes and things like that. And the son, of course, was angry. I mean, he's just absolutely angry at his father anyway. He was absent. He was never there. And, just all of this stuff. And however, so jumping ahead a little bit, the son today is in his third year of college. He is working in ministry, and he's just phenomenal. But he was given the opportunity for this small college that he's going to, small Christian college, to work in the recruitment department. And it would offset some of his costs.
Right.
And they thought he would just be fantastic at this because of his story. And he rejected the offer.
Yeah.
And so I had heard about this, and somebody said, yeah, he rejected the offer. And I said, you know what? I have a suspicion that I know why that is. I bet you it has to do with communication. I'll bet that he feels awkward, that he doesn't talk well enough, that he doesn't speak well enough to go out and sit down with these folks or with their parents, and that might even be embarrassing for him.
Right.
And so they approached him with that and said, does this have anything to do with it? And he kind of said, well, yeah, I actually it does. I think it'd be I felt like I'd be embarrassed and whatever. And they're like, no, don't think that at all. And they convinced him to do it. But sometimes we seriously underestimate the skill sets that we develop in the different environments that we're raised in. Right. And we just act like it's some simple thing for people to just overcome that.
So there's a classic looking past what's right in front of you, based on your own experiences. So you're really putting a lot of weight into what you've lived and not seeing your brother for what they've gone through. And there's a lot of that for the Christian out there now that's thinking, what do I do? Certainly some of the talking points we just said is don't stumble over your words and say the wrong thing. That's not helping out as well. So that slow to speak and quick to listen works. Yeah. But some of the proactive things, just as you talk, seem to be just enveloped around this idea of compassion, empathy. What does that look like, and how can you kind of look into what's not your experience and start to feel what others feel, or feel for what others feel?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's a sociological idea called contact theory.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as this. People that you spend time with, you tend to get to know and realize, that you really have a lot of the major things in life in common.
Right.
You want to love your family, you want to take care of your family, you have, goals and dreams and things you want to accomplish. And I think a lot of it really is about spending time with people, and being willing to listen.
Yeah.
We certainly have heard a lot of that lately.
Yeah.
Listen. And I don't want that to become a cliche thing, but I think it really is valid that says, can I at least consider the possibility that there might be something I'm missing?
Yeah.
And listen to others who are telling me that something else is going on.
Yeah, and so it is living outside yourself, which is interesting because as you were talking about the way we might look at someone who just, why wouldn't you get out of there? That is ignoring kind of what the power of the gospel really is, because the gospel comes into where you live and where you're at and saves you there. It actually changes communities from the inside. It isn't a matter of making everyone look the same. It's about everyone having the same Savior. And so in the same way, the gospel has this unique power to help us actually feel what others are feeling. Rejoice when they rejoice. Weep when they weep.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe this is where, as Americans, and I would just say this may be a general problem for our nation, we've become so individualistic that it really has become quite impossible to not only empathize with those of a different race or color or creed, but even within the church that becomes a bit of a struggle sometimes. How does that affect this individualistic view of life?
Well, no doubt we are an extremely individualistic society. That is for sure.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to talk about fundamental attributional error. I hope I got that right.
Yeah.
And this has to do with what? What does this mean?
Yeah, basically it's the idea that we have a tendency to assume that when I make a mistake, it was just circumstances. Right? I'm a great guy. But the circumstance was, and I just kind of slipped up.
Nobody's perfect. I'm willing to say that about my own mistakes.
Nobody's perfect. And I slipped up and I made a mistake.
Okay.
But I assume that it's characterological in you. It is fundamental to you as a person that you are, there's something wrong with you, and I do not extend to you the same grace that I give to myself.
I just want to point out, because one of the things I wanted to do in this particular podcast was have conversations, and not everybody's going to be in town with me. We're going to be doing this as much face-to-face as we can. In what way does changing the way we communicate affect that particular problem? Saying things online, everything in a tweet or in a quick comment, how does that affect or maybe enlarge this issue of, look, I'm going to slip up, just give me some grace. There's something wrong with you.
Yeah, and I think, again, we could do a whole series on social media, and the research is coming in and is really plain and clear on the effects of social media. It's a scourge in terms of having actual meaningful, legitimate conversations, because people say things that they wouldn't say face-to-face to one another, and they say them in ways that they would not say it to one another. And obviously, that just shuts down, conversation right away. And that doesn't tend to be very meaningful, but I think it is harmful. That I think is, look at this. I think we all see it. Unfriend me if you don't like what I said, and unfriend me here, and unfriend me there. And frankly, I think I'm going to say this because I think we need to all challenge ourselves with this. That is simply not a very mature way to approach conflict and differences.
It's not a Christian approach, for sure.
Definitely not.
And it isn't as we're kind of repeatedly commanded, looking at others as more important than yourself, or treating others the way that you would wish to be treated. It has kind of amazed me how it seems all of a sudden, although this has been maybe a decade-long process, where we have thrown all that brotherly love and conversation out the window for a quick shot across the bow of somebody else about what I believe against what you believe, and that kind of divisiveness is just kind of the way we talk. So going back to maybe some things that we can look at and work on in terms of race, I know this will bring up some defensiveness, but the idea of bias is out there, and that, if you're going to take the Bible story, here you have Adam and Eve that are the only two humans that ever enter the world without any kind of a set baggage that they bring with them.
Right.
They're created anew. Every human that's lived since has some sort of bias. And I'd like for you to address kind of what that is, maybe how we can approach this without being too defensive, be honest about it, and really start to maybe wash some of these things through.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we would like to do with this, or I was thinking about earlier, is we've all, of course, heard the word bias, and there tends to be a negative connotation to the word bias. We tend to think of that generally as a bad thing.
Right.
I want to approach this kind of from a little bit more of a neutral standpoint in using the word heuristic. And the word heuristic means mental shortcut. Biases kind of fall in under the umbrella of heuristics.
All right, that sounds positive.
Yeah, it is positive. This is good. And so I'll start with kind of how the brain, because our neurology is wired up, it is essential actually that we utilize heuristics, because our brain needs these mental shortcuts in order to free us up to do other things, right? So driving a stick shift is one of the ultimate examples of that, right? So we talked about how I could, have a sandwich and a soda and still figure out how to drive my stick shift with experience, right?
We should probably pause and explain to all younger people what a stick shift is.
Right. And don't do it.
And don't eat a sandwich while you attempt it.
No, exactly.
Go ahead.
But you can kind of hold the sandwich. You could make it happen. You could do it.
That's right.
And the reason you can do that is because of heuristics. It's because of mental shortcuts. The brain wires in things that it wants to make automatic, and it just kind of wires those in for us, so that we don't have to refigure things out every single time that we do them.
So without even thinking, this bias is what this started out. Heuristics, this mental shortcut, allows you to, in a sense, multitask, although you're not. Your brain has told you there's certain things you've got, so that you can think about others.
Yeah, and we call it procedural memory. It just makes it a procedure. You just do it. You don't have to think about it any longer. And the brain is literally wired up to do this, and it is essential for us. It's helpful for us. We need them to navigate the world. However, and that is a fantastic thing, actually. It's an amazing thing when you really consider how the brain operates and works in that way. The one place that it is challenging is often in terms of in-group, out-group, in terms of others and race.
So let's go back to that, to an illustration we talked about before we started tonight with two tribes. Let's kind of set this up and what that would look like.
So I said, let's use, the white tribe is very hostile and aggressive. And there's a black tribe over here, and the white tribe comes in and attacks them, and they have to stop and figure out, the first time it happens, well, who are these people? What are they doing here? And then they start to kill people, and you're realizing, well, wait a minute, they're here to kill us. These are very hostile people. And so imagine if your brain didn't accommodate for that and didn't make that response really quick, and you had to, every single time the white tribe showed up, you had to figure that out again. Oh, are they hostile this time? And people start to get killed again. And obviously, this is a big problem.
You're going to be gone soon.
So our brain is designed to figure this out and to survey for this and identify, based on appearance immediately, that this is dangerous and risky, and it kicks on our fight and flight and all of that stuff. And so it is actually designed to protect us. It's really there to protect us. One of these heuristics, we call this an availability heuristic. And basically, an availability heuristic means you're able to make quick judgments based on the most available information in your brain. So the brain keeps things kind of front and center that are representative, so that you can make these very quick decisions and you don't have to sit and figure all these things out. Well, the training of our brain happens outside of our awareness, It's done through the media. It's done through the things that we experience, just what we see, what we live, our environment, but also media and what we're seeing on television and so forth. And so our brain is now wiring this in for us. And so now, for example, let's get down to nitty gritty here, is if what the media has continually presented is black men as thugs and gangbangers and criminals, then that's what I'm seeing, and that's what my brain is figuring out for me and creating those representative images for me.
Right.
And so now, outside of consciousness, I see a black man, my brain pulls that representative image up for me and says, this guy's dangerous.
Yeah.
And without consciously even wanting to do this, that's the triggering that takes place and all that goes along with that.
You posted a picture not long ago. This hit me, of Tristan and his friends.
Yeah.
Goofballs.
Yeah.
Just young guy goofballs, having fun and flashing some signs.
Yeah.
And Katie walked through and she goes, I got 3 I love yous, 1 piece, 1 number 1.
Right.
But you're saying this mental shortcut might have you look at that flash image and say, this is a threatening photo.
Yeah.
There are some black youth. They're shooting some signs out with their hands without any real look or taking things in.
Right.
You've made a flash judgment and a misjudgment of who these kids are.
Misattribution.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because that the one thing that our brain is not good at is not assigning information, motives, things like that. Has to. These are what we call attributions. We attribute meaning, or we attribute motive, and we don't do well. We don't just let that rest.
Right.
And so that is all part of this shortcut system that says, here's 4 black youths, according to the representative information I have in my brain that's been pumped in there, maybe through the experiences I have had. In many cases, I think you and I could say through the experiences we didn't have.
Yeah.
Where I grew up in Oregon, there were no black people.
Right.
I did not grow up around African Americans, and Hispanic folks were generally kind of on the sidelines because they were mostly farm workers and things like that. They were kind of, I guess we knew they were there.
Right.
But we really weren't aware of them. They certainly weren't in our church, and in some cases, I guess, remember some who were in school, but not generally. Yeah. And so the only images that I had of black folks were from television or movies or things that I saw. And imagine what a skewed view that is.
So for the Christian, this is an interesting idea, because what's happened over time, without maybe planning it, and this is the way a lot of bad habits take place, we've been told things, we've been shown things, taking in images, taking in thought, and that's leading to these shortcuts that really aren't positive. And so it seems like the answer to this is kind of that taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, which means that while mental shortcuts are necessary and help us, there needs to be an inventory that's taken over time, especially when we're hearing from a great portion of society, look, it's not happening yet. We're not being seen yet. We're not being heard yet. It's not enough to say, well, no, we've made progress, we've made movement, but it's time for the individual Christian to really meditate over what could some of these biases be, and take action to kind of change the way we see an individual, an image of God. Yeah,
and it's a challenge to do that, because I can say the right things. We see some of these videos that happen right in the park, for example, and there'll be some woman who, there's a black man in the park minding his own business, and these videos come out, and there's some, it happens to be in the most recent one I saw, this white lady who's calling the cops and yelling and just making a scene, and this man is literally just minding his own business.
Right.
And yet, from most of the accounts I've seen, that is an individual who is saying the right things to her friends, like, hey, Black Lives Matter, and saying the right things.
Right.
But then when face to face in the reality of the situation, why did that change so much? Why did it change from what she's saying to what she actually did in practice? And I would tell you that very likely some of that is what we're talking about here. It is actually the result of her her brain triggering for her according to the images, the availability heuristic that she had.
Right, and you bring up a point, and this is probably the second time this thought's crossed my mind since we started talking, because in the training of kids, a lot of times actions follow intent. We kind of teach them the right things to do, and then are training into why they do it and what it means. And for the Christian, there really needs to be this emphasis on why we do what we do. We love because God loved us. Now, where does that end? And where does that, it goes everywhere. It goes to everyone. And so that ought to be that first warning light for us when love of another individual is maybe paused or difficult, or for some reason I can't even put a finger on, I feel like it's stopping short. That needs to be that warning light that says, why? What information fed this right now?
Yeah.
Now, that's not an easy fix. That doesn't happen overnight. No. And I would just venture to say, you talk about Washington, Oregon, even living right here where we're at in Colorado, there are not a lot of neighborhoods around here that are super diverse.
Yeah.
But we do have a chance to change the way we think and the why behind what we do. To lead to good actions.
Yeah. No, we have to change the script.
Yes.
Yeah. We got to change the script by being aware of what the script might be automatically.
Right.
Yeah.